Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this P3 Success Exam Specific Tips and Techniques webinar. We are delighted today to be joined by our speaker, Peter Stiff, a tutor from Astranti. Before I hand over to Peter, there are a few points I would like to make. To minimise disruption, you have all been automatically muted. If you would like to ask a question, please enter them into the questions box, as there will be a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And following this session, you'll be sent a link of the recording and you'll be sent a link of the webinar. Thank you. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this P3 Success webinar looking at the exam and specific tips and techniques. What we're going to look at in this webinar is an approach to the objective test exam, a way to maximize your chances of success, and looking at the breakdown of the topics that are specifically in the P3 content, the P3 syllabus, the way in which the exam is weighted. We're then going to be looking at a key theory from each of the four main sections of P3. And I'll also work through a question for each of those as well. So we'll have a bit of theory, then we'll have a bit of application going through a question. And we'll finish off the class by just telling you a bit about Astranti, and also we'll have a Q&A session as well. So we'll probably have about 10 minutes for you to ask any questions that you may have about the webinar that we've just covered, about the exam, about Astranti, etc. So plenty of time for you to get those questions in. And just quickly to reiterate who I am, my name is Peter Stiff. I am the head of head tutor here at Astranti Financial Training, particularly with regards to the strategic syllabus. And the main one that I'm responsible for is the strategic case study, but I also look at the P pillar as well, look after the P subjects, P1, P2, and P3. Been tutor for about 9 years now, and have spoken to many thousands and thousands of students over the years and helped many pass their exam. And I hope that the ones of you joining at the class today will be among those. And as a further thank you for attending this class today, we are offering a free P3 study text. So if you head over to the Astranti website and select the P3 study text, add that to your basket and enter the code that is on the screen now, you will get that for free. And that is a study text that is worth around about, well, you usually would pay $34.99 for that, but you can get it for free by using that code. But please do act fast if you do wish to use that, because it does expire at midnight tomorrow. So I will bring this slide back at the end of the class if you want to make a note of this, but of course you are also going to be getting a copy of this presentation, which does have the information on. So even if you are with another tuition provider or you're doing self-study, etc., it doesn't hurt to have another study text, another resource there. So do check that out and do take a look around at the various different products that we offer while you are there. So without further ado, let's get into the webinar looking at P3, the P3 exam on risk management. Very, very important subject. This is a big remit of accountants, is to be managing risk, particularly with risks specific to the operations and the financial position of the organization as management accountants. What I would also say is that the content you learn in your P3 exam is not in isolation. It's not for your P3 exam alone. You will need that information for your strategic case study, because risk is a major component of the strategic case study as well. And it's also going to be a significant part of your ongoing career as you become a qualified management accountant. So what you learn in P3 is going to be important for the rest of your career as well. The importance of risk management cannot be understated. It would be risky to understate the importance of risk management. So what's different about P3 compared to perhaps P2 or the other ones that you have studied? Perhaps you have taken another strategic level objective test already, perhaps you haven't. But if you haven't, it's important to know that the level steps up a bit. In your operational level, you were mostly answering questions at level 1, 2, 3, at the management level, 2, 3, a bit of 4, but now at the strategic level, a majority of the questions you're going to be answering are at levels 4 and 5. So that does require more use of the knowledge. It's not just about regurgitating content. You memorize the components of a model and you regurgitated them in the exam. It's not about that. It's not about knowing things alone. You have to use the information. So you have to analyze situations. You have to evaluate and recommend what an organization would do in a certain situation. You're using the information rather than just knowing the information. So on the screen here, I've got a couple of the sorts of things that you will be required to do in the exam. You'll be advising someone. So a question might be, the organization is in this situation, and a bit of explanation about the organization. We have a few options available to us. Which one do you recommend? So you're going to have to analyze those answers, those potential options, think about the context of the organization that you will have been given in the question, and think which one is most appropriate for that organization given the situation the organization is in. So that's the kind of questions you're going to be answering in the P3 exam at that strategic level. So a big step up in what you're expected to do with the information. But it's an important skill because that again is what you're going to be doing in the real world. That's what you're going to be doing in your strategic case study. So the more you learn now, the more accustomed you are to using information to make recommendations, to evaluate situations, the better it will be. So how is the P3 exam broken down? Well, it's broken down into 4 key categories. And fortunately for P3, it's not always this simple for some of the others, but for P3, it's an equal weighting. You've got 4 content areas and you've got 25% of your questions based on it. So, for example, you've got 25% for enterprise risk, 25% for strategic risk, etc. So in your exam, which will be 60 questions, you'll have 15 questions that come from the enterprise risk part of the syllabus, 15 that come from the strategic risk, and so on. And a quick introduction to what these are. So enterprise risk is more to do with your day-to-day operations and also to do with implementing new project or undertaking projects, etc., and more general risk to the business as a whole. So things like the importance of governance, the importance of risk management methodology integrated through your organization. Then for strategic risk, we are looking more to do with the risks of designing new strategies. So whereas enterprise risk is more once you're actually implementing strategies and you're carrying out your operations, this is more to do with how you make sure that the strategies themselves are sound and they are not risky. You are considering things that could go wrong with strategies that you're implementing, etc. Then for C, we have internal controls, and this is to do with audit and making sure that you have got a sound control environment in place, making sure that any risks that you've identified are being managed effectively, the controls that you've put in place to manage those risks are being adhered to effectively as well. And while we're on that subject, just something that I thought I would bring up. I'm sure you are all aware of the difference, but the examiner that creates examiner's reports for the strategic case study exam has mentioned in their examiner reports a couple of times. So of course, as a tutor, it's my job, my responsibility to make sure you're all aware of that they've often felt that some students, certainly the poorer performing students, have confused the idea of risk and audit. They are separate topics. They are ultimately in the same vein, but they are separate topics. And it's important that you know that difference and you don't expect one to do the responsibility of the other. The job of risk and risk management, or the risk committees, etc., is to identify risks and to put controls in place to mitigate those risks. The job of audit, internal audit at least, is to check that those controls are being adhered to. So it's all in the same vein, but they are slightly different jobs. It's not the role of audit to identify risk. It's the job of audit to check that controls that have been put in place to mitigate risk are being adhered to. So a very, very, very simple example would be, you've got a shop and this shop has valuable items in it. And people keep coming into the shop and stealing items because the shop is always open, even at night when everyone goes home. There's no lock on the door, so people can just walk in and pick things up and walk out with them. So the risk is that things are being stolen. So a control you put in place there might be to put a lock on the door or to put a security alarm on. That's the control to mitigate that risk of theft. Audit's job is to check that people are locking that door, checking that that control is being adhered to. So that's the difference between the two of them. And then finally, cyber risk. This was brought in with the syllabus update in 2019. So looking at the various different risks that can be posed by cyber and digital means and making sure that you've got controls in place for them. So that will be things like the risks posed by things like phishing, scams, and by people hacking into your systems, or people accidentally downloading malware which is corrupting files. So a lot of different things in P3, but it's all basically around this whole idea of risk management. So on to the exam itself, the P3 exam, how it's structured and how you should be approaching it. And what we suggest here at Astranti is that what we call the traffic light approach is a three-step approach to the exam. And the reason why we suggest this is because you've got 60 questions to answer. Pass mark is around about 60% to 70%, depending on the scaled system. So you've got a lot of questions that you need to get right. You need to be getting around about 42 questions out of that 60 correct. So a lot that you need to do. And you've only got 90 minutes. So that only works out as 1.5 minutes per question. Now, some of the questions in the exam will be very long and will take you almost a minute or more to read them. So you have to use your time very effectively in order to maximize the marks that you are going to get. So rather than approaching it in a completely linear fashion, looking at question one, spending as much time as you need on question one until you've answered it and then moving on, we suggest that you go through the exam. Every question that is short, that you look at and you think, yes, I know the answer to that, or yep, I can figure this out pretty quickly, you answer. If it's a long question or a question that you're going to think, I'm going to need some time to think about that, flag it and move on. The reason for this is because you want to make sure you get all the marks you know you can easily get. You don't want to be in a situation where you've got a minute left, you're only on question 50, and now you've got to quickly just go through and put a random answer for the final 10. Because there will have been questions in there you definitely will have been able to have gotten right if you only had a moment to look at them. So what you want to do is you want to go through, get all those quick wins nice and early, get those marks in the bank, flag the ones that you're going to need more time on. And then once you've done that is you start going back through it again, this time looking at the ones that you had flagged. Now you can spend a bit more time on these, really figure them out, look at them in a bit more detail, particularly if they're longer questions, and make sure you can get an appropriate answer for. But if you really struggle at it, do make sure you still move on though. What you should be doing here is giving yourself a bit more time than you did on your initial run through, checking through the questions, thinking, can I answer this, analyzing it in a bit more detail. If you can answer it in a minute or 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, great. If you can't, move on. You don't want to be in a situation where you spent 5 minutes on one question, you still can't figure out the answer, because again, there will be other questions you could have answered. So once you've then gone through looking at all the flagged questions, answering the ones you can answer, moving on for the ones you can't, the final round is basically just to put an answer for everything on those questions that you just really couldn't figure out, or you thought, I'm going to need 10 minutes to answer this. Because there's no negative marking, so there's no harm in putting the wrong answer down, and it's better than leaving it completely blank. So even if there's 10 questions, 5-10 questions after you've gone through it for the quick wins, you've taken your second pass, there's still 5 questions you couldn't answer, just put a random answer for everything. But you don't want to spend lots of time on the questions that you just can't answer, because that's wasted time. And if you follow this approach, you're maximizing your chance of passing, because you're using your time economically. You're using it efficiently in a way that's going to maximize the marks that you're going to get, rather than spending far too much time on a question that you just cannot answer. And that's pretty straightforward to do, because the system, the Pearson VUE system, the one that you will be using in the exam, is set up in a way that allows you to do this. There's a nice button at the top that says flag for review. And so if you're looking at a question, you think, oh, I need some more time on this, it's not one that I can answer quickly, I'll flag it for review and move on. When you get to the end, when you've done your first pass, you've got through all those answers you know you can get, is you click on the navigator button, which you can see I've highlighted there as a circle around it, and that will then bring up a menu, as you can see on the screen, that will show you all the questions you've completed and all the ones that you have flagged for review. And if you click on the ones that you flagged for review, it will take you straight to that question. So you can use this navigator to then find the ones that you haven't answered yet. Additional functionality within the Pearson VUE system, there is a scratch pad that you can make some notes on, or if you want to, if it's a calculation, etc., and you want to type it out in a bit more detail. Although for the P3, there shouldn't be as many as there was for, say, the F3, where you're doing the more financial ones. You also have a calculator if you do need one that is built into the system. You can take your own calculator in the exam, but it has to be a certain type of calculator. Only certain ones are allowed to be used in the exam. So CIMA has published a list of that. So if you are unsure, then do take a look at that list to make sure that you have a qualifying calculator and you're not taking an illegal one into the exam. So some keys to success when you are answering questions in the exam. First thing, make sure you read the whole question carefully, because there are certain words that can change the whole format of the question. And if you don't read it carefully, you risk jumping to conclusions and putting the wrong answer. So check for words like best, most, never, not, etc., because again, those can change the whole function of the question. If you're looking through the question, you're looking at the scenario, and then you're looking at some options for what the company should do, and you think, oh, that one's a really good one, they should do. But actually, embedded in there is the word not, then actually you have completely got the wrong end of the stick. You will have answered the question from the perspective of what they should do rather than one that they should not do. And also look for words like most and best, or least and worse, because at the operational level, often you might have been given a question, you'd be given 4 options, and one of them is correct and 3 are clearly not correct, or they're not really that, it's not difficult to identify that those are not correct. Whereas at the strategic level, you might be given a question with 4 options and all of them are kind of correct. But you're actually looking for the best option, the most option, or the most useful option, the most correct option, the best possible option. So even though all of them are somewhat correct, one of them might be more correct than the others. So don't just find one that you think, oh, that sounds like it's correct, that's the answer, and move on. Make sure you read all of the options and you make sure you've checked for words such as best or most. So when you are looking at multiple choice or multiple response questions, do make sure you read all the options. Don't just stop when you reach the option that sounds correct, because there may be another one which is even more correct. And if you are struggling to do that, if you can't find the incorrect option, what you should do is rule out the ones you know are not correct, because that will help you streamline your decision-making process, giving you a better chance of finding the correct answer. But also, if you still can't find the correct answer, it at least narrows your chances of getting it right if you have to select a random option. Those of you who watched it, you may remember a show that used to be on many years ago. There were quite a few different versions internationally, called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And one of the options, one of the lifelines that they had was to eliminate 2 options. So if you had 4 options and they said, I want the 50-50, it ruled out 2 incorrect options and left you with 2 correct ones. Now, even if that doesn't actually reveal the correct answer, because the 2 that you were deciding between were, or the ones that you were deciding between are still there, what it has done is now when you select a random answer, is you've got a 50% chance of getting it right rather than a 25% chance if you were just putting a random answer out of the 4 options. And some tips for finding out or ruling out the incorrect ones is to look for ones that are conflicting or ones that are agreeing. So for example, if you've got a multiple response and it says which 3 of these are appropriate options for the organization, you know that one is correct, and you've got another one which is basically saying the same thing, then perhaps that is more likely to also be correct because it's agreeing. If that was a correct option, then this one that's very similar must also be an ideal option. Whereas if you've got one that says the company should do X or the company should not do X, and you know that doing X is the correct answer, then in your multiple response, selecting the option that is the opposite that can't also be correct because it would be a conflicting answer. And if you are struggling, don't waste too much time because, as I mentioned, you can waste a lot of time very easily here if you spend far too long on a specific question. Don't waste time. Be strict with yourself. If you spend 2 minutes on a question, you still are no closer to answering it, flag it and move on. Come back to it later if you have time, because that time that you spent on that question could have been better spent elsewhere, better spent answering a question that you could answer and you could answer correctly. You don't want to be leaving the exam kicking yourself thinking, oh, I could have got that answer right if I just had a bit more time on it, but I spent too long messing around on that question that I couldn't even answer in the end. So be strict with yourself and be economical with your time. So that's an approach to the exam, how you should be approaching your P3 exam. I'm going to just look now at a few questions from the P3 syllabus, and these are exam style questions. We're going to have a very quick review of a particular topic and then look at how we would answer a question based on it using a lot of those approaches that we have just discussed in the exam technique section. So, enterprise risk. As I mentioned, this was risks that impact the running of the organization. It could be regulatory risks, it could be business risks, operational risks, and it's your job to identify these risks and to treat and review them. And so what we're going to do is look at a particular type of risk and our way in which we can identify risk. And you may recognize this as Porter's 5 forces, which is often used as a strategy tool to identify the level of competition, level of profitability within a market. But you can use it, and it is used in the CIMA syllabus for P3, as a way of identifying risk as well. Identifying, are there lots of risks posed by new entrants? Are there risks posed by suppliers and the strength of the supplier power, etc.? So essentially it's using the model, but it's just tweaking it to be focusing on the level of risk involved rather than just purely identifying whether there's supplier power or not. So let's look at a question. So engineering company H developed and patented a component that makes its vacuum cleaner more powerful and more efficient than others on the market. This component is straightforward to manufacture using readily available, inexpensive materials. Currently, engineering company H charges a high price for its vacuum cleaners that results in a high profit margin. So that's the preamble. That's the setting the scene, the scenario. Given this information, which of the following factors presents the biggest risk to engineering company H? So threat posed by suppliers, threat posed by new entrants, threat posed by buyers, or by substitutes. And we're going to use and analyze that information that we have been given in order to answer the question. So in the interests of showing how we'd approach a question, we probably could jump straight to the correct answer, but what we're going to do is break down the responses and rule out the incorrect responses. So for example, new entrants. Now we see here that the company has developed and patented, so no one else can copy it at this point, a component that makes its vacuum cleaner more powerful and more efficient than others on the market. So essentially they've got a patent that means they've got a product that's superior to others. So this means that new entrants cannot legally use this component to improve their product. So if anything, that's going to reduce the risk of new entrants coming up with something that is going to be better than ours. And that's going to be very difficult, particularly for a company, a new entrant that has no experience. So it's unlikely to be the biggest factor for us is someone else coming into the market. What about supplier powers? We've got this fancy all singing, all dancing component that makes our vacuum cleaner better, but maybe that's because we source materials that are themselves very rare and hard to find and very expensive. So could our suppliers have a lot of power over this? But then it says here in the question that the component is straightforward to manufacture using readily available, inexpensive materials. So readily available, inexpensive materials means that it's not likely that one particular supplier is going to hold lots of power over us because it is an inexpensive material that is readily available on the market. So it should be easier for us to use another supplier. And therefore, supplier power is not the biggest risk factor. And buyer power? Well, buyers, yes, there's lots of vacuum cleaners that they could buy, but ours is the most powerful and most efficient one on the market. So if they want this powerful, efficient vacuum cleaner, they have to buy it from us. We've patented it. They've got no option but to buy it from us. They could buy a vacuum cleaner from another company, but it wouldn't be as good. So if they want a good vacuum cleaner, they have to come to company H. So buyer power is then reduced as well, leaving substitutes as the correct answer. The company is able to sell its vacuum cleaner as a high profit, and that gives because of the power and efficiency. So if a comparable vacuum cleaner were to come on to the market or a comparable alternative, then that could result in us having to reduce our prices, which would represent a risk because we currently have a higher profit margin. So substitutes would be the main risk here. And again, you could also argue that the competitors would be a similar thing here. Substitutes and competitors would be similar things, but we weren't given competitors as an option. So we can rule that out as well. So that's how you would break that down using the theory, using the content in the question as well to come up with the correct answer, to identify the correct answer. So now on to strategic risks. So these are things that directly impact the strategy of the company. So we're not looking at the more day-to-day ones now. We're looking generally at the strategy. So this could be future plans for the company. The company has a strategy that is being designed. You might have to analyze that strategy and look at some information about the company, look at its mission. Does the strategy comply with the mission? If it doesn't, then perhaps it's more risky. What's the level of risk involved in the strategy? Is it a new market? Is it a new product? Is it a new market and a new product? And therefore, that's going to be very, very risky. Looking at unforeseen problems as well, perhaps by using methods such as scenario planning and looking at stress testing to see if we can identify unforeseen problems and will we be in a position where we can adapt to those unforeseen problems. Looking at the methods of growth as well. If you're expanding through acquisitions, what are the risks involved in acquisitions? The risk that you'll spend too much money, the risk that you won't be able to integrate that acquired company into your companies effectively. There might be cultural issues, there might be financial issues with that company and you haven't done your due diligence, etc. So lots of things to do with strategic risk, but ultimately it's all about looking for what could happen in the future. What issues are there with your current strategy or with a new strategy that you are trying to implement? And one of the big topics in the CIMA syllabus relating to strategic risk is stress testing. And stress testing is all about analyzing your strategy, considering what could happen to your strategy or considering what kinds of risks could go wrong with your strategy and identifying whether you'd be in a good position to deal with that. So a key guideline for stress testing your strategy is to make sure that you consider all risks and make sure you consider risks in an interrelated way. Because risks generally do not happen in complete isolation. For example, if the economy were to go down, that is a risk, but that's just not one risk on its own. If the economy goes down, it's going to have tie-ins to all sorts of other things. It's going to have ties into your suppliers, it's going to have ties into your buyers, ties into your staff, etc. So often you should consider one-off risks and also everyday risks together and how those are going to impact your strategy, and then model a mitigation strategy based on that outcome, and then make sure it's integrated with your current strategy and your operations. So what you might be asking is, well, how do you check to see if you can deal with this particular risk happening? Well, one way is to set up your bank account, is to set up your risk or your operations as if this were to happen. So for example, could you deal with a reduction in your prices? If you had to reduce your prices, 20% reduction in your prices, how could you deal with that? What you might want to do in that situation is create a separate bank account. And let's say you had to reduce your prices by 20%. So take 20% of your revenue and put that in that separate bank account and just leave it where it is. The reason why you might want to do that is then your cash flow of your main business is now adjusting, or you're now seeing how it would operate if you had a 20% reduction in revenue. All your costs are still the same, all your operations are still the same, etc. But you're now working on 20% less revenue. Now, of course, you've still got the money, you're still generating it, but you're just sticking it in that separate bank account at the moment. So you're seeing if your organization can survive with that 20% reduction in revenue. Same for, say, staff operations. What you might want to do is, say, move 10% of your staff onto a sub-project for a brief period of time to see if your operations and the level of quality, etc., can be maintained on a 10% reduction in staff. So that will give you an insight of whether you can deal with a higher staff turnover, whether you can deal with staff redundancies if you have to do that for whatever reason. Just to check that your organization can operate if those risks were to come to fruition, and make sure if they don't, that you can make mitigating steps. So let's look at a question based on this. This is all about stress testing and about which risks that James should consider when conducting his stress testing analysis. So let's read it through the question. James runs a DVD rental outlet called James Vids, and it operates solely in country T, but imports all the DVDs it uses from country D. The revenue is exclusively generated from DVDs that it rents out, and he feels that his business is in trouble and wants to conduct a stress test. And he's identified 4 possible risks. The first risk, the streaming trend continues to gain momentum, meaning that consumers are watching films online. Risk 2, that the government in country T announces a ban on importing goods from country D. 3, that his rival Jim starts a competing business called Jim's Vids. And 4, that an economic collapse in country U causes rapid inflation and a reduction in disposable income. So what we need to do is think about which risks he should look at, which risks he should analyze in order to give himself the best possible chance of mitigating the risks that are facing his business. So as before, we'll look at it in isolation. The first option was that he should consider risk 2 only. Now, not saying that risk 2 isn't a proper risk, isn't a risk that he should consider, but that is not the most appropriate option for him here because it's just one risk. And remember that we should be considering risks, everyday risks and one-off risks that are interrelated. We shouldn't just be looking at one risk alone. That's not the most appropriate approach for him when he's doing his stress test. So it's not appropriate for him to just look at risk 2 because that is a single risk and he needs to consider a few in isolation, or a few that are interrelated. So what's about option 3? They should consider risks 2 and 3 only. So Jim starting a competing business and the government introducing a ban. Now, again, these are risks. He is considering 2 risks at once, so it's interrelated as well. But the issue here is that both of these risks are one-off risks. So it's neglecting to analyze the effects of everyday risks that he also faces. So the stress test here would not be as useful because it would be considering risks that are both one-off rather than considering an everyday risk as well. So what about risk 3 and 4? That's considering an everyday risk and one-off risk, but it's irrelevant. Country U, where have we heard about country U before? We know that he operates in country T, solely in country T, but he imports all his goods from country D. What does country U have to do with everything? He only operates in country T and he only gets goods from country D, nothing to do with country U. So it's a completely irrelevant risk to consider. Country U and the economic situation of country U is not relevant to James and his video business. So again, we can rule that out, meaning that the most appropriate option is to consider the risks 1 and 2. So country T announcing a ban on importing goods from country D, which of course is a huge issue because he gets all his DVDs from country D, and also the online streaming trend, which is a continual day-to-day, everyday operational risk that is affecting his business. So that would be the most appropriate one. So again, what you should also be seeing here is that some of these are things that he probably should consider. You know, Jim starting a competing business, that could be a risk, but it's not the most appropriate answer here. So even though it was correct, it was not the most appropriate one. The most appropriate option is for him to consider risks 1 and 2. So internal controls, going back to audit and the importance of audit and the difference that it is from risk as well, which I mentioned earlier, that risk is about mitigating risk by putting controls in place. Audit is about checking that controls are being adhered to. And maintaining a sound control environment is a key responsibility of yours for the P3 exam and also the strategic case study. So what we're going to do is talk about audit. Audit is vital for organizations. It is different from risk, and you must make sure that you have an effective audit team. Now, an effective audit team must have a leader. A leader generally will report directly to the audit committee, and they need to act absolutely independently from the rest of the organization. They must act ethically as well. There's no point in having an audit team that is acting unethically. They must have adequate numbers of staff. If you've got lots to check, you need 10 people to check it, and you're only getting 5 people for your audit team, that's not an effective audit team. They must have sufficiently trained staff as well. So for example, if you've got to audit really complicated financial instruments, You can't have someone that's got no financial experience doing that because it wouldn't be effective. They must have a robust auditing procedure, a process for passing that information on to the audit committee. They must have the authority and the remit to review the whole organization. A manager of a division can't say, no, I'm not letting the audit team have a look at my work. They have the audit team has the authority. They're acting on behalf of the directors of the organization, the audit committee, and they have the authority to act as if they were a director of the organization. No one can tell the audit team they can't review X, Y, and Z. So let's look at an internal audit charter here. It's a copy of company HW's internal audit procedure. So section 1, the head of internal audit must report to the divisional manager, who then passes the findings on to the audit committee. The members of the internal audit must be able to access any information to carry out their audits effectively. The internal audit department must not contain more than 20 personnel selected from various departments, and these staff must be given adequate training to fulfill their role. And all auditors must rotate and review all departments, including their own. So people selected from the organization must be responsible for reviewing their own departments. So which sections of this would lead to an effective internal audit? So again, let's break down the various different parts of the question and figure out which is the correct answer. So of course, the role of internal audit is to oversee the effectiveness of internal controls. That's the main thing we're looking for here as we answer the question. So what about section 1? The head of internal audit must report to the divisional manager and pass the findings on to the audit committee. Well, that's right out. The audit needs to be independent of management. Managers cannot block findings. They cannot tell auditors what they can and cannot review. So anything that relates to section 1 is incorrect because that is not part of an effective audit. Because the audit must be able to bypass managers. Managers should not be able to see the findings and pass them on because they could conceal things. So we can rule out options 3 and 4 because section 1 is not part of an appropriate internal audit. What about section 3? The internal audits must not contain more than 20 people. Now, a few things here. They must be appropriately staffed. There's no arbitrary limit for an internal audit department, so saying it cannot have more than 20 people is not effective. They must be independent as well. So when we think about section 4, its own department, you can't have people auditing their own department because they might have unconscious bias towards that. So that is not correct. The only thing that is correct there is that they must be given adequate training to fulfill their roles. Just a further extension there about section 4, it's incorrect. The audit, they must have the skills to review a certain department. It's not just arbitrarily rotated because you then might get a situation where someone from marketing is reviewing finance and vice versa, and they have no idea what they're looking for. So they must have the skills to know what they are looking for, and reviewing their own or their former department may compromise independence. So we rule that out. In fact, the only thing that is actually part of an effective internal audit here is that auditors must be given access to all the information needed to carry out their tasks effectively. So a lot the company HW could do to improve their internal audit here, because actually only one of those 4 sections is part of a good internal audit process. Now on to the 4th part, cybersecurity. And so this will involve, the kinds of questions you'll involve here will be about what is a cyber risk, the various tools and techniques that you can use to manage risk, the processes involved, etc., and what threats that you might face as parts of, or what threats might be faced as a result of cyber attacks. So there's a few things that you may need to do here, a few ways in which tools or techniques you might use here, such as forensic analysis, where you investigate your computer system to see what has happened, how the attack might have been carried out, who it might have been carried out by. The malware analysis, so you're looking at the malware that's affected the systems, what allowed it to gain access to the computer systems, what allowed it to infect the system. Storage analysis, which again is a type of forensic analysis, and that's looking to do with the specific data and specific files, which ones have been altered. Penetration testing, where you simulate an attack. You basically try and hack your own system to see how you would get into it, and that will then allow you to put controls in place to mitigate it. And you've got various different things that you can do to try and combat it, such as a digital resilience program, which is where you build in cybersecurity to your own approach, and also simulated phishing as well, where you send a false email or you send a false thing out to see how people react to it. Do people respond to it? Do people install it, etc., and so on. So quite a few techniques that you can use as tools to mitigate cybersecurity. So what would we do? How would we use that to answer a question? So we've got Company T here, and they offer a number of different marketing services. Some of the copywriters at Company T noticed that some of the files relating to an advertising campaign the company was developing were missing. The files went missing around the time as a disgruntled employee left the company. Additionally, Company T's IT team has noticed the presence of unknown software on multiple employees' computers. Recommend which of the following cybersecurity techniques would be most appropriate for Company T to use to investigate these suspected breaches. So let's look at each of these in turn now. So, simulated phishing testing and network analysis. Now, network analysis is used to assess the entire network for suspicious activity, whereas phishing testing is used to test vulnerabilities in the system before something happens. Now, this would not be appropriate, the right combination, because it's only a few specific files relating to an advertising campaign. There's no mention of a software that has been installed that has been causing problems with the specific files at this point. And we know that it's only some files relating to an advertising campaign. So spending a lot of time analyzing all of the different files would perhaps not be an appropriate use of time at this point. And also, we know that it's only on a few specific computers rather than network-wide. So that would not be an appropriate way to approach it. So what about network analysis, storage analysis, and malware analysis? So again, we've already discussed about network analysis is used to search the entire network for suspicious activity, but it's contained on a very specific few bits at the moment. And while storage analysis, which looks at ultimately the structure of the files, etc., and the employee's computers, it's not alone going to be enough. It needs to be done in conjunction with another analysis, which is also why it would not help with the software. It would only help with the files, and it's the correct method for helping with the files as opposed to a network analysis, but it's not going to help with the presence of unknown software on multiple computers. So instead, they should conduct storage analysis and a malware analysis, because storage analysis is the forensic analysis that looks at the file system. So we're looking at specific files to see if they've been modified, if they've been deleted. For example, we could see if the disgruntled employee, if they were going to have access to those particular files. If they weren't, then it's probably not their fault. It could be that it was just done elsewhere. Also, malware analysis, where specialists look at the malicious software on those employees' computers and see whether or not how it was installed on the computer. So that is the right approach for them to take. So before we jump into the Q&A section, just going to give a quick introduction to who we are at Astranti. Some of you may have heard of us, some of you may not. We are a company that specializes in the CIMA exams as well as the Chartered Management Institute assignments, and we also produce CPD courses. And we're renowned for very high quality, easy to understand material, and we've helped thousands and thousands of students pass exams over the years. In fact, we've had over 90,000 users use our content over the years. And we produce a lot of material. So for example, for P3, We produce study texts that break each syllabus down into all the different component parts. We break it down in a nice, digestible way. We also produce revision notes to help you re-revise the subject closer to the exam, and we have videos for everything as well. We've got our exam practice kits, which look at each topic or each chapter and ask a lot of questions based on that to check your comprehension, check you understand it. We've also got mock exams as well. And we have a video series that looks at questions. So basically what I've done there, where I've looked at 4 different questions and broken them down in a quick way for the purpose of this webinar. We have 100 questions that we've broken down in a more detailed way as part of our course as well. So that's our objective test video debriefs, where we look at 100 questions and we break them down. There's also an online community where you can access and you can discuss with the various different tutors and the various different other students that are on the course as well. So once again, a big thank you for attending today. I hope you have found it useful. I hope you feel better about approaching your P3 exam now, particularly with regards to that information about exam technique and how best to approach the exam, to use that 3-step process to really maximize your chance of passing by maximizing your chance of earning as many marks as possible. And again, a big thank you. We are giving away a free P3 study text, and you can access that by going onto the Astranti website, finding the study text and entering that code in the exam. But do check that out and use that code to get 3 studies. So even if you've got a Kaplan text or a BPP text, etc., it can't hurt to have another study text. So is there enough time to complete the exam? It's a very time-sensitive exam. Just a question coming in here. Yes, of course, there's plenty of time. It's going to be very difficult to fully answer every single question in the exam, but that's part of it as well. It says managing your technique, which is very important. So that's why we suggest that you get all those quick answers, because the questions for the most part are weighted fairly evenly. So a very quick, straightforward question to answer is not going to earn you much less than a big, long, complicated question. So it's best to spend your time wisely answering the questions you know you can get right, rather than wasting time on a question that you're unsure of. So yes, there is a lot of time issues with this exam, but it's definitely possible, particularly but you need to be wise with your approach. So how many select all that apply questions can you expect in the exam? There shouldn't be that many. There might be a couple, but CIMA for the most part has basically tried to withdraw them from the exam because they can be unnecessarily confusing. And of course, it's a test of your ability to answer the questions and apply the knowledge, not about catching you out with why select all that apply type things, etc., that can be unnecessarily confusing. So there shouldn't be that many. There might be the odd 1 or 2, but there won't be a lot. And so when you are approaching the select all that apply questions in the exam, my advice would be to rule out the ones that are definitely incorrect, then rule out or rule in the ones that are definitely correct, and then take a bit more time on the ones that are on the fence. So for example, if you've got a select 4 that apply or select 3 that apply, you might find that, and you've got 5 options, you might think, well, those 2 are definitely incorrect, those 2 are definitely correct. And then you have to spend a bit more time on that 5th option to decide whether or not is correct. But as I mentioned, it's unlikely that you're going to have lots of select all that apply questions in the exam, because CIMA has taken steps to remove them. And that approach will also put you in a better position for making a judgment call, because if you've ruled 2 in, you've ruled 2 out. Generally, 3 of 5 or 2 of 5 is the most appropriate amount. There's unlikely to be a select all that apply where all 5 are correct, for example, or 1 is correct. So make sure you think about that as well. If you can only think of one answer, it's unlikely that's going to be correct. They're unlikely to give a select all that apply question that's only got one answer. So middle to someone who's failed the exam 3 times with mid to high 90s, you're basically almost passing because it's 100 out of 150 for the scale score. What I would do is look at the breakdown that CIMA has provided with you. CIMA will have provided a breakdown of where you were strong, where you weren't so strong, etc. And focus on the areas that you are strong, you are not strong in. Because if you're passing, say, part A or part B, time and time again, what's the point in spending too long re-revising that? You really need to focus on the ones that you are struggling with, because that's where you're going to get the best out of it. For example, if you're failing because you're getting 58% and you need to get 60 to pass, and you're always getting 80 to 90% in part A, 80 to 90% in part B, but then 40% in part C, then there's much more room for improvement, and a reasonable improvement in part C will lead to a big change in your overall pass, whereas it's very difficult to make anything but an incremental improvement to the areas that you're already strong at. So I advise you to work on your weaker areas as much as possible, and your weak areas should be given to you by CIMA, because they should give you, when you fail an exam, it should give you the breakdown of the areas where you passed and where you didn't pass. And if you are, sorry, the questions are jumping around. And as an approach to saying what should they do between now and their exam to maximize their chances of passing, the best thing that you can do is probably take mock exams. The reason why mock exams are so useful is because it's obviously testing your knowledge, but it's testing your knowledge under exam conditions as well. Because one of the reasons people fail this exam often is because of time management, often it's because of issues with exam technique. So it's always useful to do that. So question there about the discount code saying the option is exceeded. If you are having problems with that, it should be the correct code, but there should be a section on the Astranti website, there's a talk box. If you message the customer service team, they'll get it sorted for you. It should be correct. I will be able to check after the webinar, I'll be able to check that it is correct. But it should be working. That is a new code that has been created specifically for this webinar.
Hi, Peter. I think that's all the questions done for today now.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You'll receive an email in a few hours' time, which will include the link to a recording of the webinar and a survey. And we'd be grateful if you would take a few moments to give us your feedback online. Thank you very much for your time today, Peter.
No problem.
And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.